The language of kindness. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Harrison and Associates, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. Margaret Harrison had built this investment firm over 30 years, and she knew every corner of it. But this morning, something was different. The coffee machine in the executive lounge had broken down again. It was a small thing, really. But in the quiet ritual of morning coffee, Margaret had always found a moment of peace before the day's demands began. She stood there, staring at the silent machine, when she heard a gentle voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I try to help?" Margaret turned to see David Mitchell, the building's maintenance supervisor. She'd seen him around for months, always with that same quiet smile, always moving purposefully through the halls. He was probably in his late 40s, with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd known hard work. "I'm afraid it's beyond help this time," Margaret said, managing a tired smile. "We'll just have to call the repair company." "If you don't mind," David said softly, "I've fixed quite a few of these. Would you let me take a look?" There was something about his manner, a gentleness that reminded Margaret of her late father. She nodded. As David worked, Margaret found herself watching him. There was care in every movement, a kind of mindfulness that seemed rare these days. He didn't rush. He didn't force anything. He simply understood. "You know," David said quietly as he worked, "my daughter tells me machines speak their own language. You just have to learn to listen. She wants to study engineering someday." "How old is your daughter?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious now. 16, David said, and there was such warmth in his voice. "Smart as a whip. Wants to build bridges someday. Says the world needs more things that connect people." Margaret smiled. "She sounds wonderful. Does she get that wisdom from her mother?" David's hands paused for just a moment. "Her mother passed away 4 years ago. Cancer." He said it simply, without drama. Just a fact he'd learned to carry. "But yes, she does. Sarah always said the best things we build are relationships." The machine suddenly hummed to life, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee began to fill the air. "There we go," David said, standing up with that same gentle smile. She just needed someone to listen to what she was trying to say. Before Margaret could thank him properly, her phone buzzed. A crisis with an international client. She glanced at the message, then looked up at David with a frustrated sigh. "This is going to sound odd," she said, "but this client, they're in Sao Paulo and our translator is stuck at another meeting. You wouldn't happen to speak Portuguese, would you?" David's expression didn't change much, but something flickered in his eyes. "I do, actually. Also Spanish, Mandarin, French, German, Italian, and English, of course." Margaret felt her jaw drop slightly. "7 languages? My wife and I used to travel," David explained quietly, a distant warmth in his voice. "Before she got sick, we worked as volunteer translators for medical missions. We'd go wherever we were needed. Sarah always said language was just another way of showing people they matter, that everyone deserves to be understood." Margaret found herself sitting down, the coffee forgotten. "David," she said slowly, "what did you do before you came here?" "I was a translator for the United Nations," he said simply, as if he were discussing the weather. "After Sarah died, I needed to be home more for my daughter. The hours at the UN weren't good for a single father. This job? I'm here when Emma leaves for school, and I'm home before she gets back. That matters more than anything else right now." The weight of it settled over Margaret like a warm blanket on a cold day. Here was a man who'd given up a prestigious career, who spoke 7 languages, who'd traveled the world helping people understand each other. And he was fixing coffee machines, not because he had to, but because he'd chosen what mattered most. "Would you—" Margaret hesitated, then continued. "Would you help me with this call? Not as maintenance staff, but as someone who understands what I'm trying to accomplish." David considered for a moment, then checked his watch. "Yes," he said. "But after my shift ends at noon, if that's all right. I have 3 more floors to cover this morning, and I don't like to leave work unfinished." The call that afternoon changed everything. Not just because David's translation was flawless, or because his understanding of cultural nuances saved $1 million deal. It changed because Margaret saw something she'd forgotten in her 30 years of climbing ladders and breaking glass ceilings. She'd forgotten that success isn't just about how high you climb. It's about knowing what altitude is right for the life you want to live. Over the following weeks, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about it. Here she was at the top of her profession, working 70-hour weeks, rarely seeing her own grandchildren. And there was David, who'd stepped away from the world stage to be present for his daughter's algebra homework and school plays. One morning, she found him in the executive lounge again, checking on the coffee machine. "David," she said, "I have a proposal for you." He looked up with that patient expression she'd come to recognize. "I'd like to offer you a position as our senior cultural consultant," Margaret continued. "Part-time hours. You'd work with our international clients, but only 20 hours a week. And you'd choose when those hours are?" David was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because," Margaret said, and she felt something catch in her throat. "Because watching you reminded me what wisdom really looks like. It's not about how much you know or how impressive your resume is. It's about knowing what truly matters and having the courage to honor that. We need that kind of wisdom here." David smiled that gentle smile. "I'll accept on one condition," he said. "That you leave work at 5 o'clock at least twice a week to have dinner with your family. Your assistant mentioned you have grandchildren. I bet they'd love to see you more." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. When had anyone last cared enough to challenge her like that? "Deal," she whispered. 3 months later, the firm was thriving in ways Margaret hadn't expected. Not just financially, though David's cultural insights had opened doors across 3 continents. The whole atmosphere had shifted. People were leaving at reasonable hours. Parents were making it to soccer games. The coffee machine in the lounge had become a gathering place where conversations happened at a human pace. One morning, Margaret found David there as usual, and they stood together watching the sunrise paint the city gold. "You know," Margaret said, "you could have told me who you were when you first started here." David smiled that gentle smile. "Who I was?" "No, ma'am. I told you exactly who I am. I'm a father who fixes what's broken and speaks the languages he needs to speak. The rest is just details." Margaret picked up her coffee, breathing in the aroma. "Your daughter was right," she said. "The world does need more things that connect people." "Yes," David agreed, looking out at the morning sun. "And more people who understand that kindness doesn't need translation. It's the one language everyone speaks, if they choose to." They stood there together in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words. That sometimes fixing a coffee machine is about more than just the coffee. That sometimes success is measured not in corner offices, but in being home for dinner, and in that quiet moment, with fresh coffee and morning light and the promise of a day spent honoring what matters most, that was more than enough. The end.